Good afternoon. Welcome back to another session on my Declassified Caribbean News Network channel. Now, the title for today is Ebola, AI, and the Coming Sunday Laws. Now, could future pandemics, artificial intelligence, and global emergencies pave the way for a new era of religious and governmental control? As fears surrounding Ebola and other global health threats grow, many are asking whether the world is moving towards systems of centralized authority, unlike anything seen before. From AI surveillance and digital tracking to emergency powers and restrictions on movement, the foundations of a new control structure are rapidly emerging. But could future crises also reshape religious freedom? In this video, we explore the connection between pandemics and expanded state power, how AI surveillance systems are transforming society, the role of fear in changing public behavior, digital IDs, biometric tracking, and social monitoring. The historical and prophetic debate surrounding Sunday laws, whether future emergencies could accelerate global religious regulation, and the implications for the Caribbean and the wider world. This is not just a discussion about technology, it is a discussion about freedom, belief, power, and future direction of society itself. Are we witnessing in the early stages of a system that could fundamentally change civil liberties and religious expression? Watch the full analysis and share your thoughts below. And let me just give you a brief overview of what the Ebola virus is, lest you are not very aware of this very dangerous virus that is creating a storm. And we're hearing news coming out of the United States that people, even green card holders who have contracted the disease and they're abroad, they cannot return to the United States until they're healed. And US citizens who are coming from countries like in Africa where the virus is, they're suggesting, well, not all the African continent, you have some, as I've suggested. So don't now attack me that I'm saying all of Africa has it, right? Because we talk about Congo and other countries that they're suggesting where the virus might be circulating. But those Americans who are there, if they have contracted and if they're permanent residents, not their permanent resident means green card holders, they cannot return to the United States. Citizens can, but green card holders might not be able to return. They're saying cannot until they are cured. But even American citizens, they have to go through, I think, the Dallas International Airport before they can return safely to their homes. Now, Ebola is a severe and often deadly viral disease caused by the Ebola virus. It primarily affects humans and some animals. It was first rather identified in 1976 near the Ebola River in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is where the virus got its name. Key facts about Ebola: it spreads through direct contact with blood, bodily fluids, contaminated objects, infected animals. So that is how you are going to be able to get the virus. It is not typically spread through the air like the flu or COVID-19. But remember now that that was also, COVID-19 was also strange. And what if they have, what you call it now, worked on the virus, manipulated the virus in lab, and it can change the way how it normally behaves. That we have to think about. But naturally, it is not an airborne virus. Common symptoms include fever, weaknesses, muscle pain, vomiting, diarrhea, internal and external bleeding in severe cases. That's very, very sad, and it's very, very worrisome, should I say the least. The disease can have very high fatality rates in some outbreaks through survival rates, improve those survival rates, I should say, improve significantly with modern medical treatment and early care. Now, major outbreaks have occurred mostly in parts of Africa, especially the Democratic Republic of Congo, Guinea, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and also Uganda. The 2014 to 2016 West African Ebola outbreak became globally famous because it killed more than 11,000 people and caused worldwide fear about a possible international spread, which, if you remember that, it was creating a real scare until COVID came here in 2020. Why Ebola creates fear? High death rate, graphic symptoms, rapid deterioration in severe cases, association with quarantine and emergency powers. And that is going to happen because it seems even scarier than COVID-19. It is in fact scary. And if it should come into my region, I would be scared too. Because of this, Ebola is often discussed in conversations about pandemic preparedness, biosecurity, emergency government powers, surveillance systems, global health infrastructure. Scientists continue to research vaccines and treatments, and there are now approved Ebola vaccines that help control the outbreaks. But with all of these things, they always say that there is a new strain, and they might create different, narratives to increase people's fear, right? To augment their fear. Now, what if the next global crisis does not just change healthcare, but changes religion, law, and freedom itself? What if pandemics, artificial intelligence, and climate emergencies become the justification for governments to introduce laws once thought impossible in the modern world? And we saw that during COVID, so we don't have to repeat ourselves, do we? And what if the idea of Sunday laws is not as distant from reality as many people think? And we saw Trump the other day suggesting that the Jews should have a Sabbath day, where he was institutionalizing, as it were, a day of memorial of the so-called Sabbath, the Jewish Sabbath. But should the president be celebrating a religious sect day of worship? Maybe not. This afternoon, we examine a topic that sits at the intersection of prophecy, technology, public health, and political power: Ebola, AI, and the coming Sunday laws. By the way, the Sabbath is not for the Jews, right? The Sabbath is for everyone. The Sabbath was created during creation, long before any Jews came on the scene. Very important that you understand that very important biblical fact. Many people think that the Sabbath belongs to the Jews. That is to the contrary. It contradicts essentially what the Bible and Jewish history actually teach. Welcome back to the channel, all right, to the Declassified Caribbean channel. Remember to like and to share and to subscribe. For many people, the idea of Sunday laws sounds like ancient history or religious speculation, but history tells a different story. In fact, the United States already had what were called blue laws, laws restricting activities on Sundays for religious and moral reasons. These laws existed in various forms for generations and were discussed extensively in legal and political debates during the late 1880s. That is the late 1880s, right? What we call late 1800s, including around 1888 during major national discussions over Sunday observance legislation. And this law could have been implemented had it not been for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who sent what's his name there? I forgot his name now, down there to debate in Congress. And he went and he actually debated the members of Congress, allowing them to understand that the United States was founded on the separation of church and state, right? And he did a fantastic job, and those laws were put on hold. Now, when laws are made, when they're crafted, and if they are not implemented at the time, it doesn't mean that they disappear. It just means that they are just there until the state is ready to effectuate them, to implement them, okay? So be careful of that. Now, this is important because it proves something critical. Governments have already legislated religiously influenced rest days before, right? So governments have already legislated religiously influenced rest days before. And we saw that by the Sunday law, the blue laws that were implemented or were about to be implemented, but were crafted to be implemented, but which were prevented because A.T. Jones, that's the Seventh Adventist man who went there. His name is A.T. Jones. So you can go there and research A.T. Jones and his debate against the blue laws of 1880s, specifically 1888 in the United States. A brilliant historian. And what has happened once in history can happen again under new conditions, especially during periods of fear, instability, and crisis. One pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. Governments gain extraordinary powers during emergencies, wars, economic collapse, terrorism, natural disasters, pandemics. And yesterday we heard again where there were shootings going on right before the White House, So things are happening at a rapid pace, and anything can change, and the entire infrastructure is going to come crumbling down. And when I say infrastructure, I mean the infrastructure of freedom, of civil liberties. When societies are frightened, populations become more willing to accept restrictions they would normally reject. COVID-19 demonstrated this clearly. Within months, governments across the world restricted movement, closed businesses, limited gatherings, imposed emergency powers, expanded digital surveillance, tracked populations through technology. Many of these measures would have sounded unthinkable before the crisis. Now, imagine a future pandemic perceived as deadlier and more terrifying as the Ebola pandemic or health emergency would be. Something like Ebola spreading internationally. Fear changes societies quickly. And we can see that even here in the Caribbean, people respond to podcasts based on fear. And that is how they're very reactionary to whatever is going on in the world. They don't want to know the root causes of the crises. What they want to know is the symptoms, right? And after the symptoms are going to be able to control you. And once fear dominates public consciousness, governments can justify almost anything as necessary for public safety. Artificial intelligence is changing the relationship between citizens and the state. And when we say artificial intelligence, it's what we're called AI. AI systems can now monitor online speech, analyze facial expressions, track movements, predict behavior, flag dissent, monitor financial activity, connect health records with digital identities. And I did tell you one of the reasons I think the Iran war is not going to stop and it's going to get worse is that they are trying to re-engineer, as it were, the financial infrastructure. And very soon the dollar might not be in existence, or any dollar at all, whether the US dollar or the British currency, whatever dollar that you have, they're going to digitize the entire economic ecosystem, and so that you'll be able to be tracked more efficiently. So when you think that this person is losing the war, they're not losing the war. We're the ones losing in every facet of our lives. The modern surveillance state no longer requires massive numbers of human agents. AI automates surveillance. And during future pandemics or emergencies, these systems could become even more powerful. Imagine AI-managed digital checkpoints, biometric verification systems, digital IDs linked to healthcare status, automated enforcement of emergency laws, and predictive policing tied to public risk. Many people may willingly accept these systems if they believe they offer protection from disease, crime, and environmental disaster. That is the key point. Fear accelerates compliance. Now, another major factor enters the equation: climate change. Today, climate change is increasingly linked to nearly every major societal issue: migration, food shortages, disasters, economic instability, disease outbreaks, even crime itself. Some policymakers and commentators now argue that rising temperatures contribute to increases in violence and social unrest. Whether one agrees fully or not, the political significance is enormous. Because once governments define climate change as a permanent emergency, extraordinary powers can become permanent too. This creates a situation where authorities may claim that drastic societal changes are necessary to save the planet, protect public health, or preserve social order. And historically, crises often produce moral and religious movements calling for national repentance, unity, and social discipline. That is where discussions around Sunday observance could eventually re-emerge in modernized form. Remember now when they talk about climate change, even the Pope in his the one of his encyclicals, Laudato Si, right? The Laudato Si that Pope Francis wrote in, I think it was about 2015, 2016. He mentioned that people need to go back to a day of rest because of climate change. That we're not resting, the environment is not properly rested, and the environment needs some rest. During the pandemic, they were talking about that too, that when we were locked down, it was good for the environment as people were not going to work daily, so the environment was rested or was resting at the time. Many people today are unaware that Sunday laws were already embedded in American legal tradition. Blue laws restricted commerce, labor, and public activities on Sundays. And by the late 1800s, especially around 1888, debates intensified over national Sunday legislation tied to religious observance and public morality. One of the things that fails to amaze me is how much US citizens are ignorant of the very country that they live in, ignorant of the very country that they live in. And with the typical people, when you speak to them, you realize that there is nothing really, they're not aware of the whole political and religious landscape and the history of the country in general. This is not conspiracy theory, by the way. It is historical fact. The important lesson is this: societies can legally enforce collective behavior during periods of moral panic or national crisis. Because at the end of the day, we are not leaders. The majority of people living in the world are not leaders. And I've been saying this ever so often that many of us are just followers. We follow what our friends are telling us and what the group, the circle in which we find ourselves, we do what they do. We do not stand up for what is right. And that is how, and then we do it based on ignorance also. Many of us are not properly informed. And laws that once fade away can always return under new names and new justifications, perhaps not initially as explicitly religious laws, but as environmental rest days, as they're suggesting already. Public health shutdown periods, national unity observances, climate emergency measures, social stabilization policies. So they will just tell you that, in order to help us to come together, we need to take a day off and to interact with each other, with our families, and with the wider community. The mechanism already exists. Government power expanded through crisis. Now, it's not that these things are not necessary. Let me just say that we need a safe environment. We need an environment that is not overworked or overly worked. But the fact of the matter is, when governments begin to tell us that this is the way how it ought to be done, and create and craft authoritarian laws, we've got to be very careful and skeptical, because many times it's the religious element that controls that sort of dictatorship, even though sometimes we don't look at the religious element. Many of us don't, do we? But we have to remember that in Revelation 14, verse 9, it says, "And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if any man worship the beast," because there is people are going to, if any man, so the entire system is going to require that every man worship the beast and his image and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand. Now, remember now that the forehead is what where we make our decisions, the frontal lobe. So we read or we listen, and that is where we make our value judgment. We decide whether we're going to do something or not. Now, having made the decision in your head, you have to do it, right? So if you are practicing, the hand there is the doing. Are you doing? Because there are times when we know what is right, like during the pandemic, there are people who knew that something was wrong, but they went against their judgment and did that which was wrong. The same thing is going to happen during the mark of the beast, that there are people who are very convinced of what they believe and know that the mark should not. It's a system, it's not a literal mark now. It's a judgment that you will have to make. You have to stand against a system, a religious political system. And if that decision is made in your mind, but you're pressured because, for one or many reasons, you have to feed yourselves and your family, or you just want to follow the crowd, as many people generally do, then you find yourself that you are going to get the mark of the beast right here in your forehead. Now, there are those people, again, who, um, you know, who will do it because they want to do it, getting it in their hands, right? It's, you just go ahead, just go along, right? That is what you just go along to get along, if you will, right? So that is what is going to happen. So that's no literal mark, and that's what we have to understand. The pandemic, we could call it COVID-19 pandemic. We could have called it the Sunday Law Junior, because that is exactly what is going to happen. But that is on a grander scale. Okay, so the law is going to be on a grander scale. Now, combine all these forces together: pandemic, AI surveillance, climate emergencies, economic instability, which is coming, social polarization, rising crime, moral anxiety. This creates fertile ground for populations to demand stronger authority and stricter regulation. And throughout history, periods of uncertainty often produce calls for spiritual revival and moral restoration. The question becomes, could future governments merge technological control with moral legislation? And they're calling for moral legislation because our society is getting out of hand. Could AI systems eventually enforce laws tied not only to security and health, but also behavior, movement, and even forms of social conformity? These are questions people once dismissed entirely, but the world is changing rapidly. The Caribbean is especially vulnerable because small economies are heavily dependent on foreign systems, international finance, imported technology, tourism, global institutions, digital infrastructure. And whatever happens in places like the United States is going to definitely happen in the Caribbean. We are a part of that US infrastructure. Many people don't believe it, but we are part of the North American continent, I should say. All right, we are part of the North American continent, and they're dividing the world up into 10 regions. And the little Caribbean islands, the little Caribbean territories, are part of that grand infrastructure called the North American Union, whatever you want to call it. If larger powers adopt new global standards tied to health, climate, or digital government or governance, smaller nations may face pressure to comply, and Caribbean societies could eventually experience forms of surveillance and emergency regulation imported from abroad, particularly the United States of America. That is why these discussions matter, because once infrastructure of control are normalized, reversing them becomes extremely difficult. Like the COVID-19 emergency laws, restrictive laws, they cannot be eradicated. They're there forever. Hope you understand that. To be clear, technology itself is not evil. Public health measures are not automatically tyrannical. Environmental protection is important, but history teaches that crises often become turning points for the expansion of state power. And we have been seeing where the state is expanding over the years, and not in a good way, not to protect our liberties, not to help us financially, and to beat back the tide of exploitation and abuse. They are actually the abusers of power. We're seeing that. So we can't, we don't want that sort of false intellectual proposition that the government is working for the good of the people, because historically and even right now we can see that they're not working in our best interest, are they? And freedoms rarely disappear all at once. They erode gradually, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, even after 9/11, once one emergency at a time. So that's what they do. They gradually go away, or they gradually eradicate them one emergency at a time until it is implemented as a whole. So the existence of blue laws in American history proves that societies have already enforced religiously influenced national behavior before. The rise of AI, future pandemics, and climate emergencies may create conditions where governments once again reshape law, freedom, and public life in dramatic ways. Whether one sees this through a political lens, a historical lens, or a prophetic lens, the conversation can no longer be ignored. If you found this analysis thought-provoking, subscribe, share the video, and leave your thoughts below. Do you believe future crises could lead to new forms of moral or religious legislation? Or do you think fears about Sunday laws are exaggerated? Thanks for watching. See you in the next video. Remember now to like and to share and to subscribe if you haven't yet done so. Ciao.